Before I begin, I would like to highlight that I do not condone harassment towards the creator in question. My video is purely to highlight mistakes that they have made and can potentially remedy. So, what happens when you combine a newcomer's perspective on Pokemon and a bare-bones understanding of how stats can benefit each other? Well, this list for one. Okay, so some proper context would be in order for this video. So, meet Chris Littlechild, the subject of today's video. Chris is a games journalist on the site The Gamer. All in all, not too bad, but not too great. His list on the top 20 weakest Pokemon of all time ended up catching my eye, and if you ask me if it's because some of the Pokemon I use have ended up here, or because I just disagree with the basic idea of most Pokemon being considered weak, my answer would be this. A little column A, a lot of column B. See, for the most part, I don't believe in the idea of an innately weak class or character in JRPGs, because with enough work and strategies, the two things that the genre already encourages, even a proportional joke character can become a god-tier badass. And on a production note, when I have something to say, the entire entry will be read before I actually say anything so as to avoid accidentally removing context, and because he tends to use run-on statements. Now, without further ado, let's get into the topic.
Abra. Now, sure, we all know what an indisputable boss Alakazam is. The original Psychic-type powerhouse has been crushing souls and shattering dreams into soggy, tear-stained pieces for 2 decades now. You don't mess with Alakazam and his glorious mustache. Sadly, when you first encounter the species in the wild, it's usually in the form of the pitiful Abra. Feeble and defenseless, it knows just one move, teleport. All this achieves is a real annoyances for the trainers trying to catch it. It has high special attack and speed stats for a first form, but you can't make much use of them because it won't learn any attacks until it evolves in Kadabra. What's worse is that it only becomes Alakazam when traded, so if you don't have a friend to play with, you won't reach Abra's full potential.
On the move pool point, I really have to ask, why are you only ever looking at level up moves as opposed to all 4 methods of learning up with a core one? All 4 at the time. Out of all the unevolved Pokemon, Abra has one of, if not the widest move pools to play with. Guys, I'm sorry to have to do this, but I'll actually have to keep a running tally of all the times he does this. And oh joy, the unless it's fully evolved isn't weak argument. Who hurt you? Because the idea is in and of itself flawed. See, some Pokemon have moves that can only be learned if they don't evolve into a certain point, and others actually have a reduction in a particular stat upon evolution. Not to mention the existence of Eviolite, but I'll save that one for the Eevee segment.
Shedinja. Now, lots of fans like Shedinja. If players dig all things a little macabre and out there, a husk of dead skin that can steal your soul will be right up their alley. 7 thumbs up for your horrifying concept, Shedinja. As most Pokemon go, we're scraping right through the bottom of the barrel into the muddy ground, with its maximum HP stat of 1 being simply abysmal. The gimmick with Shedinja, of course, is its Wonder Guard ability, which makes it immune to all non-super effective attacks. This is cool in theory, but is very tough to use consistently and practically in battle, since so many types are super effective against the Ghost and Bug type, making it mostly useless without an absurd amount of planning.
Oh my god, are you not considering the fact that the 1 HP total is designed to cause players to think laterally when using Shedinja? Shedinja's Wonder Guard renders it immortal when used against a Pokemon who cannot hit any of its weaknesses, allowing you to set up the evasion boosts as well as all the 2-turn hiding moves such as Dig or Phantom Force. Also, it only has 5 weaknesses to its 13 immunities, which is pretty solid for it. Finally, that comment about planning implies you don't quite understand how JRPGs work.
Love Disc. The Pokemon world has had its share of strife, but the franchise still tries to stay true to its cutesy, friendly, trade with your buddies beginnings. Hence the existence of Love Disc, a marine Pokemon whose sole purpose is to bring joy and lifelong happiness to couples who encounter it. You can't say fairer than that, and it's certainly appealing to look at. The disappointment comes after you look at its moves and stats, and realise it's almost impossible to deal damage, and learns hardly any moves that aren't normal or water type. People thought that Alamoa Mola in Pokemon Black and White would be its much needed evolution, but was never connected to this new Pokemon, and remained utterly pointless besides farming its signature heart scale items for the move Relearner.
See, this is what happens when you look at a white mage and instead of healing, you see a damage priority. You put it on the list because it doesn't have many direct damage moves. When first, it has 34 moves that can deal damage one way or another, and more importantly, it's a fucking healer! Also, the preference for normal or water type moves, look at what they do instead of their typing. Those moves are there for support instead of just damage.
Snom. Snom and its evolution Frostmoth are also Sword and Shield newcomers. Prior to the game's release, there was hope that Frostmoth would prove to be an ice type, Volcarona equivalent, a fearsome special attacker and major setup threat. While there's little truth to that, it takes a whole lot of work to set up a sweep with Frostmoth. This isn't surprising at all if you simply look at Frostmoth. It doesn't have a base stat above 45, in brackets, special attack, with its speed as low as 20. It has only 2 moves in this learn set, Struggle Bug and Powder Snow. Frostmoth can do some heavy lifting with its hidden ability, which halves all special attack damage it takes, but its pre-evolution is subpar, even by baby Pokemon standards.
First off, you accidentally, I hope, call Frostmoth Snom, then you use Snom's poor remove pool and baby status to explain why it's weak. See, if I play the good faith, bad faith game here, the good faith interpretation of this section is that you made a mistake and were under a deadline, resulting in you not being able to fix it even if you had noticed, to which I would suggest pacing yourself more and reread what you wrote a few times over. But if the bad faith interpretation is true, you deliberately obfuscated Snom and Frostmoth so that you could Mott and Bailey Frostmoth onto the list by proxy, to which I would call you a dishonest hack and never take you seriously on Pokemon ever again. But back to the list. You're ignoring how Frostmoth... Editing Angel here, I meant to say Snom instead of Frostmoth, sorry about that. Also has that ability and is actually on par with the other babies, so it doesn't entirely make sense to be here.
Eevee. There are tons of Pokemon you'll see later in this list that are only good when they evolve, but Eevee has been one of the most popular Pokemon to never be good, despite all the boosts it receives. Everything from a unique Z move to a Gigantamax form have tried to make the original normal type form useful, but nothing has done the trick in a mainline game and it's always just been better to evolve it. The only exception to this is in Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, where it's finally given a variety of unique move, tutor attacks with overpowered abilities, but even then it's not usable in most other Pokemon appearances and gets by on some buff stats. In this spin-off, making it feel just as empty as any other attempted boost to the neutral beginnings of Pokemon's biggest evolution line.
Hey, remember how I said to remember the Eviolite for the Eevee segment? Well, now it's time to explain why I kept it on hand. Eviolite is an item that boosts the defensive stats of a Pokemon yet to evolve it. What's Eevee's most famous traits? Why, it's evolutions, of course. But on Eevee's stats, fun fact, the generalistic nature of them combined with the broad, if somewhat limited move pool, allows players to be creative with how they build the little guy and allowing for some spectacular tricks in its pocket.
Bite-Off. In the early stages of any Pokemon adventure, players have some pretty simple foes to cut their teeth against. These are the early route trash of Pokemon like Pidgeys, Rattatas, and Lillipups that teach you the fundamentals of catching and battling. Of all of these Pokemon, none have seemed as hopeless as Bite-Off. The derpy expression on its face told you at a glance this thing wasn't Elite Four caliber. If it appeared in a player's party at all, it was as an HM user, fulfilling the role pretty well thanks to its convenient normal and water type body. Outside of manual labour, Bite-Off has never received any moves, abilities or stat boosts to make it worth using, and that includes its equally dopey evolution of Bibarel.
The early route Pokemon aren't actually trash if their potential is nurtured enough though. For example, let's look at Lillipup, shall we? Lillipup has some rather low stats, but when you get to Stoutland, with enough dedication and the right EV strain, you can end up with a borderline force of nature. Now, with an idea of how the potential is there for Route 1 Pokemon, let's return to Bidoof. See, Bidoof has a generalist stat and move pool, allowing for creativity in builds and utilization. And on your stat point, I would like to point out how all of its abilities tie into stat changes. Simple doubles their value, Unaware straight up isn't impacted by them, and finally Moody cycles through those changes and thus keeps the enemy on their toes. All of these benefits go double for Bibarel, so with the evidence I've provided, I would like to contest that Bidoof and Bibarel are Elite Four material.
Plusle and Minim. Of the several Pika clones to be released in each generation of the Pokemon game, Plusle and Minim are surely the weakest by a huge margin. They were introduced to be a complementary tag team partners with the abilities that boosted each other's stats to give them an edge in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire's new double battle system. The problem is that this ability is attached to a pair of embarrassingly weak cheering Pokemon that don't have many attacks outside of electric type moves. And even then, a lot of fairly weak ones like Spark for most of the game. In theory, these should be as strong as they are adorable, but instead they end up being utterly pointless and have never gotten a sufficient buff to be effective.
First of all, that's borderline cheating. Plusle and Minun are different from each other. Next, the power move is more than just a number next to it, that's the proportional power of it. And finally, they aren't just direct attackers, they're buffers. Not every Pika clone is an attacker, and they don't all have to be. In fact, if they were all attackers, their identities would severely be limited in variety.
Far-fetched. Even the biggest fans of flying-type Pokemon, those who consider the in-game bird keepers their spirit animals, have their limitations. You can try to find spots in teams for even the most overlooked and underappreciated flying Pokemon. But Farfetch'd is one of the toughest sells of all thanks to poor stats and no evolutions to pursue. When base stats, usefulness, charm and charisma were being handed out to the original 151, Farfetch'd found itself at the back of the line. Its saving grace is that it now has a Galarian form and an evolution Surfetch'd. But its base Kanto form is still one of the memes of the Pokemon series due to its inability to battle against even the simplest of foes.
You mean Farfetch'd the Berserker? The Pokemon whose focus on attacking has bled into its abilities, resulting in it potentially being unflinching, always highly accurate, or rarely having higher damage when other stats are lowered? See, Farfetch'd stats are all average, save for its physical attack stat, and many of its moves have high crit rates, often compensating for a lack of a stab with them.
Zubat. This poisonous little bat craves attention, or at least that's the only explanation most people can think to explain why it shows up nearly every 5 steps in any given Pokemon cave. It's useful for grinding experience, its evolution Golbat is hardly an improvement, and maximising its friendship stat to evolve it into Crobat takes years off your life. This Pokemon has essentially become more meme than monster, becoming a symbol of irritation in the Pokemon world, rather than a lovable member of the original Pokedex. When most players are asked who is the weakest Pokemon, Zubat is almost always going to pop into their heads while they consider an answer.
Oh, you know, it's designed to be reminiscent of how bats are one of the most common animals you'll find in a cave, and that they're more likely to be of one particular subspecies as well. Dude, if you think 455 is barely any higher than 245, you need to go back to math class, because Golbat is almost twice as strong as Zubat is. And on the Crobat aspect, there's more than one way to improve friendship, and some of them are better than others, while others yet are improvements to existing methods. For example, in games where your Pokemon can follow you around, letting them do so will actually accelerate their friendship growth.
Wobbuffet. Remember the Super Smash Bros. Sandbag? The poor little guy's only purpose was to be beaten on. It looked happy enough doing it, granted, and its trophy in the game promised that it actually was. But the Pokemon world's equivalent doesn't seem anywhere as capable of taking a punch with a smile. This sad beast is completely unable to deal any damage at all by itself. Its only joy in his life is to absorb attacks, then use Counter or Mirror Coat to hit back for twice the damage it took. If it had great defense stats, this could be pretty impressive, but instead it lacks much besides a high HP stat, meaning most powerful attacks will still probably kill it in a single shot and not give you any opportunity to counter.
You know, I actually almost skipped this one by mistake while scripting. That should tell you something about how little this boy belongs here. So, let's talk about how those low defenses that make the HP pool worthless actually allow for Wobbly over here to deal more damage. Wobbuffet's move pool is, yes, limited, but look what's in it. Counter, Mirror Coat, Encore and Destiny Bond, an incredibly solid 4-move setup for a Pokemon as counter-heavy as Wobby here. And those powerful one-shots are only really one-shots if the Pokemon using them has enough points in the relevant stat pool, and the Wobbuffet trainer opted not to boost the Pokemon's HP?
Unknown. This terrible Psychic type is perhaps the hardest of all to make work in battle. It learns a grand total of one move, which is Hidden Power, making it incredibly hard to stand up against nearly any opponent that outmatches its terrible arsenal. It's not often thought of for its weakness, since it is tied into lots of Pokemon lore, but otherwise it's been useless in any appearance it's made. Since they are living hieroglyphs, after all, I suppose that's a party trick worthy of note if you want to spell out funny or inappropriate words. Its signature move, Hidden Power, doesn't even exist in the later games, so they've now become even more irrelevant.
This one is the exception to my belief that nothing is inherently weak in the JRPG, mainly due to the fact it's not really meant for combat anyway, so not much of an issue here, though its placement does make me wonder. Is this list meant to be a countdown, or is it just a general list? Because the number system you're using says one thing, but the nature of the entry says something completely different.
Pumpkaboo. Many of the worst Pokemon in the game are also the oldest, but one of the biggest exceptions is Kalo's own Pumpkaboo, an adorable haunted jack-o'-lantern that features a growingly popular combination of ghost and grass types. In theory, this Pokemon is quite neat due to each one having a different size, which takes the form of different HP and speed stats. Unfortunately, this doesn't lead to high enough stats to particularly matter, and even when this grass type evolves into Gorgeist, there aren't high enough stats for any size beside the biggest and smallest to be relevant. Even then, they aren't anything spectacular compared to other Pokemon, making it somewhat of a lost cause.
Well, separate sizes can't have absurdly different stats, because it needs to retain the same stat total so people can more uniformly understand it. Also, it doesn't lead to high enough stats to particularly matter. You do realize that it has a consistent base defense of 122, right?
Post point again, I meant to use Pumpkaboo stats, I instead used Gorgeist stats by mistake. My bad.
So, it can take a few hits. And once again, I have to wonder if you're deliberately anti-generalist or not, because the two middling sizes are generalists in terms of stats. And don't think I missed that comparison to make it look worse. Just because there's something that has higher stats doesn't mean this one's weak. In fact, this is where you look at move pools to see if they have ways of working around those lower stats. This is common for many RPGs. Need I bring up the Bravely Default to Red Mage stats again?
Slack off. Many Pokemon will get better when they evolve, but few of them lag behind the others as much as Slakoth. This two-toed sloth is famous for its lively evolution of Vigoroth and its titanic ape evolution of Slacking. But getting to either of these means somehow getting a Sakoth to level 18. It is almost impossible without long and exhausting swaps with other Pokemon, as it learns hardly any moves that deal damage and will rest every other turn due to its semi-unique Truant ability. If you can evolve it into Slacking, its strength and defense are able to make Truant slightly less useless, but this is a huge ask for such a pitiful creature.
Somehow, I can think of 3 different ways in which you can do that beyond the switch in, switch out method. They are healing on the Truant turns, using an XP share and multi-battles, and on the it learns hardly any moves that deal damage. Need I remind you that TMs exist? And Slakoth's HP, defense, and attack are already solid with a base of 60 points each. You even left with a parting jab at the little guy. Apologize or else. See, this boy can take and deal damage pretty decently. Its biggest drawbacks in terms of stats is its speed.
Igglybuff. There are all kinds of baby Pokemon introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver, and most of them are surprisingly effective in battle. Elekid and Magby ended up being great version exclusive in Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, while Pichu has a place in many different players' hearts for its cuteness and Volt Tackle attack. Igglybuff falls much further behind than most others, having some of the weakest stats among any of these Gen 2 baby Pokemon. Its HP stat is substantially higher, but with one of the lowest defense and special defense stats in the game, it might as well not be there.
Okay, I have to ask this as well. where did you get the idea that high HP is rendered meaningless by low defensive stats? You're asking a non-tank to be made into a tank, when being a tank is against its identity. Buff is meant to be something of a healer/support Pokemon, which means it's not designed for single battles, but multi-battles with a teammate on the field.
Metapod. It's hard to list off weak Pokemon without just gravitating to the bug types of the series, but Metapod and its sister species Kakuna are undoubtedly the most incapable of the bunch. There's an entire episode of the anime dedicated to their usefulness, as Ash battles another Metapod trainer while the two face off underwhelmingly. If you evolve from a Caterpie, this can mean it's able to learn Tackle, but it doesn't have any worthwhile stats besides defense, and will still be a terrible user of this Vanilla Strike. It's a truly fundamental example of the weakest Pokemon in the series, and is nothing but a roadblock on your way to the infinitely superior Butterfree.
Only if you caught them in their cocoon stages, while also neglecting TMs. We don't use the anime to gauge the strength of Pokemon or their move pool. See, this is because the anime makes up things and has a separate canon to the games. For example, did you know that Meowth cannot actually learn the move Tickle? Yet, Team Rocket's Meowth used it in the Orange Islands arc. In addition to String Shot at level 1 and Bug Bite at level 9 from Caterpie, both Caterpie and Metapod can learn Electro Web via TM. And on stats, Metapod also has 50 HP, just 5 behind its base defense.
Magikarp. Here it is, Magikarp. The terrible Pokemon all other terrible Pokemon aspire to be. Now the series does love hammering home the old effort pays off thing. Since the first generation of games, the true powerhouses have taken a lot of work to evolve. The Dragonites and such of the world take a lot of experience to reach their final forms, evolving much later. Magikarp doesn't take all that long, becoming the almighty Gyarados at level 20, but it's a pain to raise to that point. Magikarp is the ultimate joke Pokemon, even armed with its own signature comedy move in the form of Splash. Making Z-Splash actually relevant in Sun and Moon was a nice touch, as it could raise Magikarp's attack stat to hilarious heights. But with no Z moves in later games, its power has returned to oblivion.
Hate to break it to you. Wait, no, I don't. But Magikarp is able to learn Bounce via TM and Hydro Pump via TR, thus significantly expediting the level up speed and allowing you to reach Gyarados at a reasonable pace.
Delibird. Delibird is yet another sorry specimen from the depths of the base stats basement. Like some others we've come across in the course of this list, Delibird manages to combine just about every awful trait a Pokemon can have into one horrible raging failure of a creature, highlighted by a vulnerable type combination of Flying and Ice type. With its low defenses, offenses and everything else, it's completely outclassed at everything it could possibly try to do. Finally, just to set itself apart, it has another special trait, its signature move. Present. Deals either damage or healing towards the opponent instead, meaning it's one of the only Pokemon that will actively benefit your opponent.
Stat-wise, Delibird is a really solid generalist with a lot of room for creative builds, and not some sorry specimen, as you put it. Before I actually say anything, mate, this and its evolution Golisopod were my go-to water types in Sun, Ultra Moon, and Sword. You're on thin ice with this one.
Wimpod. When it comes to the 7th generation, there's nothing more feeble than Wimpod. You probably came across this poor soul during the water trial, shuffling around on the beach, trying not to draw attention to itself. To catch the teeny shrimp, you had to be a little crafty as it tries to flee from you on sight. Appropriately enough though, Wimpod's ability is Wimp Out, which will automatically switch it out of battle on taking a hit. It's an all-round pitiful little thing. That's not the end of the story, as Guzma and his beastly looking evolved Golispod will tell you, but still, Golispod's own ability, Emergency Exit, is just a fancier phrasing to try and hide its weak roots.
Do you want to know how Wimpod overcomes its feebleness? Versatility in TM and TR moves, not to mention its level up moves allow for more survivability on their own. But in fact, you can take advantage of Wimp Out and then Emergency Exit in order to repeat usage of the move First Impressions, which deals significant damage. Not only that, but it allows you to heal it in the back while a beefier Pokemon takes the hit for it, and if the only reason this baby is on the list is because of its ability, then I have to say that's one of the more weakly motivated ones on the list.
Smeargle. Smeargle deserves at least one mention because at its core it's exceptionally weak compared to nearly every Pokemon. Its stats are some of the worst for its size, and with no evolution to obtain, it can easily feel like a waste of time for most trainers. The only way for it to be powerful is through its unique move Sketch, which can let it permanently learn any move in the game so long as it's used before Sketch is activated. This means you can teach Smeargle some powerful signature moves from powerful banned legendaries like Darkrai, but you still need to hope it won't faint before it slowly uses one of these attacks on a much sturdier opponent.
You know, maybe those low to average stats are where they are in order to balance out Smeargle. Not to mention, its abilities allow for no confusion from own tempo, boosting of lower power moves, Technician, or random stat changes through Moody, all of which can allow for rapidly shifting battles, which Smeargle is clearly designed for.
Geodude. There are all kinds of candidates and descriptors for the weakest Pokemon. Having bad moves to choose from, large numbers of weaknesses, and irritating appearances can leave a horrible impression, and there are a few Pokemon in the entire series that accomplish all three of these as effectively as the Arm Pebble Geodude. This is one of the only Pokemon that has absolutely no hope in winning against nearly any opponent. Its physical defense is quite high, but this doesn't make up for a depressingly high 6 different weaknesses. A tragic special defense stat, and one of the lowest speeds in the entire series. Nearly every common move in the game can take down a Geodude from Kanto with ease, making it undoubtedly the biggest waste of the trainer's time and the worst Pokemon you could add to your team.
Geodude can easily handle fire and or flying types due to its rock typing, not to mention it can have a super effective stab on ice types as well, and that's just via level up. Via TMs, Geodude is capable of learning fire, fighting, rock, electric, and ground type damage moves, allowing for it to be able to handle grass, ice, steel, and water types, with the only true risk factor types being ground and fighting types. Also, that special defense stat is a remnant of how they used to calculate damage, and the only types it's weak to that prefer that special damage are all accounted for by its TM move. Next, we have the article you linked. It doesn't support your point as much as you think it does, as every Pokemon on it has a lower speed than Geodude. Then there's the fact that the most common moves in the game are actually typically normal type and or stat based. Finally, this list is ordered, but that leads to the issue of what metric you're using, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Final thoughts time. For some reason, when discussing move pools, you only ever looked at what the Pokemon could learn by a level up, as opposed to all the relevant methods, thus arbitrarily limiting their usefulness. As one can infer, a lot of the issues that put some Pokemon on the list are solved by accounting for TMs, HRs, TRs, and egg moves. You also seem to have something of a vendetta against generalistic Pokemon, often calling them worthless even though their generalism is a strength they hold. You tried to say that because there's a better Pokemon in certain areas, that the one you're talking about is in turn weak due to that. That's not how that works, and it completely ignores the intended role and what tools it has to play with. On more than one occasion, you treated high HP as meaningless without high defensive capabilities, which once again ignores how roles work. Finally, you complained when a Pokemon lacked a powerful direct damage move, as though that's the only thing a move pool should hold, yet again ignoring roles and how they interact. I give you advice for if you try again, but I really think weakest Pokemon lists aren't good for anything more than poking fun at and pulling apart.
And with that, this has been Angelo Rosso, and remember, you can always do better.